Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen Khan.
And I'm Simon Cooper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast.
Last week's episode was about Pep Guardiola, the human being who became a GOAT. Please give it a listen.
Today's episode is on Mohamed Salah, the Egyptian attacker who I am going to be arguing is the most influential Arab sports figure of all time and someone whose appeal transcends the Middle East and Africa. Now, Simon, lest we are ever accused of being too Western or European-centric in our choice of players, I'm also going to argue that Salah, currently in his 7th season at Liverpool, is an icon in the Muslim world, and I'd put him up there with people like Muhammad Ali, the boxer, and Khabib Nurmagomedov, the UFC fighter, as one of the greatest Muslim sports figures of all time. But unlike Ali or Khabib, you almost never hear Salah speak about religion or politics.
This is a story about a footballer whose big break may never have happened if it weren't for the Arab Spring of revolutions and the terrible consequences in his native Egypt. He's a man who's helped alleviate racism in one part of England,
and who I think should be the first Arab player to ever win the Ballon d'Or and only the second African of all time.
Mehreen, I'm really curious, why does Salah mean so much to you? I mean, you're a Chelsea fan. He was a nobody at Chelsea.
That's partly the reason why I'm a little bit fixated on Salah, because like most Chelsea fans, I'm always thinking, what if he left the club after an unremarkable season and then came back to bite us big time a few years later and now is the icon that he's become in English football. But I'm also a Salah fan, and I say that in the literal sense, because as a Muslim in the UK, I think he's really helped change some of the worst parts of the discourse in countries like Britain around Muslims. I mean, part of my life is spent trying to humanize Muslims in public discourse, and Salah has managed to do something that I probably will never achieve.
Do you feel that you experience racism very often as a Muslim going around in Britain?
I think I'm lucky because I don't look obviously Muslim to people. I can pass. But when your name is Muhammad, you have a beard and you prostrate on the pitch every time you score a goal, you don't have those luxuries. Salah definitely doesn't have those luxuries. And I think, Islamophobia in the UK and in most countries in the West after 9/11 has been so much about perceptions. And in a world where most footballers are from European countries, South America, and now even North America, having a footballer from the Arab world at this particular time is what I think makes Salah very special. And this is not to say that there aren't Arabs who play football, and most of the ones that you think of are players like Karim Benzema, Zinedine Zidane, who are part of the diaspora in countries like France, and even Sadio Mane, who's one of Salah's ex-teammates, is one of the greatest African footballers of his generation.
And also a Muslim.
But I think I'm going to argue that Salah is unique because he comes from a country, Egypt, the most populous Arab country in the world, that has never really produced a player who's received the accolades and I think has the talent of Salah.
And who has got Scousers singing about wanting to be in a mosque.
Exactly. But I think Salah's importance comes from the fact that he carries the hopes of a nation and a region on his shoulders. So he's up there with people like Messi and Michael Jordan in terms of his talent and his sporting achievement. And then you've got to mix in the George Weahs or the Didier Drogbas of this world, who are also African footballers, who are also of huge political importance to their countries. So that's why I think Salah is very, very special. He is a young man of a generation that went through the Arab Spring and the terrible consequences of it. And it's from a country which has suffered near economic collapse. And he is, as I said, carrying the hopes of millions of young Egyptians every time he steps out onto a football pitch at Anfield.
And he also has to not upset the regime too much. Difficult one. Let's look at his extraordinary stats.
So Salah has scored 281 club goals for Liverpool at the time of our recording and 44 in his first season, the season where apparently he was a Chelsea reject that was never going to make it in the Premier League.
He had the monkey of Mourinho on his back.
Exactly. He's already scored more goals for Liverpool than legends like Robbie Fowler, Steven Gerrard, Michael Owen. He's beaten Thierry Henry's record of most European goals scored for an English club in the Champions League. And he scored a goal that made Kenny Dalglish, Liverpool legend, cry when he helped put Liverpool 1-0 up in the Champions League final against Tottenham, a game which they eventually won.
And he scored the last-minute goal against Congo that qualified Egypt for the 2018 World Cup, country's first World Cup in 28 years, although the 2018 World Cup will come to end up a complete disaster for Egypt.
And Salah is currently the highest-scoring African player in English football.
So, Mehreen, tell us about his childhood.
So Mohammed Salah is born in 1992 in a small village called Nagrig, which is about 100 to 120 kilometers from Cairo. Importantly, his father and both of his uncles on his mum and his dad's side played football at a very amateur level. And that is one of the factors that means that young Mohammed is allowed to continue playing football at a time when his mother would prefer that he was in school, passing exams and trying to find a real job like other young, relatively poor boys in Egypt at the time. As a young teenager, Salah tells a story of travelling up to 8 hours a day, so a 4-hour commute each way to play for his local club. He used to wake up at 5 o'clock to go to school, get up to 5 buses just to get to training as a teenager in Cairo. His father used to accompany him because he wasn't allowed to travel alone. He was a pretty special kid because he only had to go to school from the hours of 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and then would be released to go out and attend football training by his teachers, and used to have a special permission slip to get him out of class.
I was really struck by the fact that he was not a forward when he was a kid.
Yeah, and I guess like most of the players that we're going to talk about, the positions they end up being great in is not often the ones that they play when they're children. So he's a fullback, and he stands out very clearly among all the boys of his age, and he's very, very quick, characteristic that he develops, hones, and I think uses really well to his advantage when he gets much older. But around 14 years old, he has a coach who thinks this guy's pace needs to be used on the wing. He becomes a winger, and at the age of 17, he's so prodigious that he's actually playing professional first-team football with grown men at the age of 17 with a club called the Arab Contractors in Cairo.
And it starts to seem possible that this kid from a village who's grown up watching the Champions League, idealising Ronaldo and Zidane, that he might actually have a professional career.
Yeah, that wasn't always obvious to him. So he is surrounded by family figures who like playing football, but nobody in his extended family ever made it professional. But the young Salah is very, very quickly running up the ranks of professional football in his native country. So 2012 is a very important year for the young Salah. He's 20 years old. And at this point, he's kind of on the radar of all big Egyptian clubs. He's also making some headway with the national team, and he's destined to play for one of the big teams in Egypt.
Al Ahly or Zamalek.
Exactly. But his sort of nascent and very promising career collides with one of the most violent events in modern Egyptian history. And this is 2012, 1 year after the Arab Spring. What were you doing in 2011 during the Arab Spring?
I was watching the Arab Spring on social media and television, obsessed. I mean, the big square in Cairo, Tahrir Square, was full of protesters, bringing down the dictator Hosni Mubarak. And it seemed like, to naive people like myself, that Egypt was having its democratic revolution. It would become a democracy. Everything would be great.
I was at university at the time, and I had only read and watched TV coverage of when the Iron Curtain fell in parts of Eastern Europe, and seeing people putting flowers on tanks in former communist
it was like the
parts
Berlin
of
Wall
Europe.
all
And it
over
felt
again.
like living that in a part of the world where I think that would always felt like a distant dream even a few months ago.
Yeah, there were no democracies, But then it goes horribly wrong.
It does. So in 2011 is, a landmark year in Egyptian history, as we've already mentioned. And it's young Egyptians, people of Salah's generation, who do come out onto the streets and are instrumental in toppling Hosni Mubarak, the long-standing dictator of Egypt. It's one of the most remarkable, democratic convulsions of the 21st century in a region which has just been blighted by war and geopolitics up to then. And it's a country where autocracy had been the norm and was destined to be the norm forever, it seemed like.
And so there's this brief flowering of freedom, and it's also football fans, the kind of football hooligans of Al Ahly who are helping lead the revolution and fighting the forces of Mubarak's regime. And it's just a great moment. It's one of the happiest moments, I think, in Egyptian history.
Within a year of the revolution, there's an election, but the party that wins the election, their leader is arrested, and the military try and consolidate their power over Egypt once more. And there is a general sense of lawlessness and chaos that descends in Egypt. And in February of 2012, it also creates the conditions for one of the worst and most fatal footballing disasters of recent times, which is the Port Said disaster, which killed 74 people in clashes between Al Ahly and Al Masry supporters.
And we've got on the show, I think, the best person to explain this, James Montague, who wrote the book about Middle Eastern football, When Friday Comes. So the Port Said disaster, it's a game between Al Ahly and the Port Said team. And at the end, there's a pitch invasion by the home fans, and they attack the Al Ahly fans, and the Egyptian police stand by and let it happen. That's how I understand it.
Let's roll the clip.
I think you can look at the Port Said massacre or riot or stampede, however you want to call it, as kind of the beginning of the end of the Egyptian revolution. Football was, and certainly when it came to the kind of football fans in Egypt, they were quite an important constituency in the revolution. And this kind of catastrophic loss of life on the 1st of February in 2012, where 72 fans of Al Ahly lost their lives after a game versus Al Masry in Port Said. It was just after the 1 year anniversary of the revolution. Egypt was still under a kind of temporary military dictatorship. And because the ultras of Al Ahly, which is, there's these guys called the Ahlawi, had played such a central role in the revolution, there was a genuine case to be answered for that there was collusion between the fans of Al Masry and the Egyptian state in punishing this group, this constituency, which had become a thorn in the side of SCAF, the kind of the temporary army force that was taking over. And in the aftermath of that, there was an attempt by them to get justice for their dead. And to do that, they basically said, we are not going to have any football matches in Egypt. Every time the Egyptian FA tried to bring football back, because it's a big money spinner in Egypt, they literally protested the matches to stop it, and they successfully stopped the restart of the league for almost a year. And so in terms of football, this was a huge thing for a country like Egypt to go without football for a year, because all the football was gone. There's a lot of Egyptian players that do end up in European football. The Swiss team Basel picked up Mohamed Salah very cheaply and quickly, and he moved to Europe probably 2 or 3 years quicker than he would have done. So you could make a case that if it wasn't for Port Said, that might not have happened, or it certainly wouldn't have happened so quickly.
Salah wears the number 74 on his shirt as a tribute to the victims of the Port Said disaster. What happens is that once domestic games are cancelled for that season, Basel, one of the Swiss domestic teams, host a sort of solidarity friendly with clubs in Egypt, and that includes having a match with the Egyptian under-23s. And Salah plays brilliantly in this game, which is going to be another theme about how most of his transfers come about. He spends around 18 months in the Swiss league, and in that time he plays 3 times against Chelsea in various European competitions and scores 3 goals against them. And lo and behold, it only takes a while, and then Chelsea signed Salah up as a 21-year-old for a fee of 11 million euros in 2014. And interestingly, they also fight off the interests of Liverpool.
Because Liverpool were only offering 8 million euros.
They didn't think
really
he was worth it.
Yeah.
So we could have skipped this slightly painful and circuitous route from Switzerland to Liverpool if it wasn't for Chelsea.
So the Arab Spring and then the Port Said disaster transform his career. They propel him out of Egypt almost immediately. He leaves the country much quicker than he would have done otherwise. And you think that ever since, those events have hung over his career and shaped the way that he is perceived?
Yes, I mean, he leaves the country at a time of complete chaos. And his rise and his trajectory in European football afterwards is also matched by the increasingly authoritarian nature of Egypt, which we're also going to go through. And it's in those conditions that Salah becomes such a hero. He is not in exile, but he is outside of the country, and he's never really returned there. And there are questions about whether he will ever return back to Egypt as a footballer. But the story of Salah's significance is that he's part of a very small way of trying to return dignity to the revolutionaries or the young people who had their dreams crushed, because he went to Europe and seems like he is living a dream.
Yeah, I mean, it's become a very sad and miserable country. Poverty has got worse, the repression is awful, and Salah is kind of the one bright Egyptian light in the world outside. And he's also of the age of those revolutionaries, of that young generation whose dreams were smashed.
And there's another important, I think, facet of the young Salah's life is that he isn't the subject of crazed scouting from the world's biggest clubs or European clubs. Perhaps he's on the radar of a few of them. But as a young kid in Egypt, he's perhaps not always considered to be an obvious place where you can find the next Premier League great. Actually, his journey becomes, meteoric and happens very quickly, because he does something which is a bit of a cheat code in football, is that if you play really well against the few good teams that you might face in a season, then that's how you get onto the radar of some of the biggest clubs in the world.
It's really a primitive way of scouting, of a guy plays well against you once and then you sign him. But that's what Chelsea did. It didn't work for them. Liverpool, when he finally does go to Liverpool, will scout him in a much more sophisticated way.
But he almost never makes the move to Anfield, and that's because he's not Jurgen Klopp's first choice, not even his second choice, and probably not even his third choice.
The story of how he does go to Liverpool is, I have to say, a bit bizarre. and we're going to tell it after the break.
So, you want to be a marketer. It's easy. You just have to score a ton of leads and figure out a way to turn them all into customers. Plus, manage a dozen channels, write 1 million blogs, and launch 100 campaigns all at once. When that's done, simply make your socials go viral and bring in record profits. No sweat. Okay, fine. It's a lot of sweat. But with HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools, launching benchmark-breaking campaigns is easier than ever. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
This is a reminder that you're listening to the Heroes and Humans of Football podcast with me, Mehreen Khan.
And me, Simon Cooper. So you join us as the young Mo Salah has just arrived in England. He signed for Chelsea. And Mehreen, it doesn't really work out brilliantly.
It doesn't. He signs for relatively little fanfare. I mean, unless you're an Egyptian football fan. I remember at the time we signed this guy is 11 million euros for big bucks Chelsea. It's not anything special. This is a team which has Eden Hazard and Juan Mata and Diego Costa in it. So, he's kind of seen as a bench warmer, I think, by the fans.
Yeah, 11 million euros, that's kind of their coffee bill.
Peanuts. Salah describes that year at Chelsea, that season at Chelsea, as one of the hardest of his life when he's being managed by Jose Mourinho.
How does he do, this kid?
He scores a goal in one of his first games against Arsenal. He comes on as a substitute in a 6-0 thrashing, which is Arsene Wenger's 1,000th game at the club. He gets, I think, one more goal and a few assists, but he's basically never really starting games. It's a stop-start season. And to be fair, I think it would be difficult to say that he deserved a place in a team which has people like Willian, Fabregas and Hazard. And they're also a Chelsea team that go on to win the league in 2014. One of my kind of enduring memories of him is seeing him come on as a substitute, often when the game is won or lost. And he's really, really quick, but he sometimes just runs ahead of the ball. He forgets to take the ball with him. And for fans, he seems like disparagingly a bit of a speed merchant, right? He has a lot of work to do with the ball. He's very underdeveloped. And it's quite frustrating watching a player that has a lot of raw talent not really be able to express it with the big boys in the Premier League.
He hasn't played at that level of football before, and he has this incredible gift of pace. He's a high-skilled player, and judging by his later progression, he's obviously a learner. He has that gift that some footballers have of, okay, I understand I don't have this, and every month I'm going to get better. There's footballers like that. I think Virgil van Dijk at Liverpool is one of those who people looked at him and they thought, no, he doesn't have it. Those players are learning at a pace that other players are not matching.
But Chelsea do what they often do with players that are talented, that they've signed and they want to develop. They send him out on loan.
And Mourinho's quite disparaging about him.
I mean, he's subsequently gone on to say in interviews that he thought Salah was a lonely and fragile boy, which kind of is a bit of a character assassination because it suggests that not only is he not able to integrate into life in England, but maybe he's not got the mettle for it.
Well, Mourinho must be very embarrassed by Salah's career and by Kevin De Bruyne's career, because Kevin De Bruyne is also at Chelsea just before then and also is rejected and sent away. And it must hang over Mourinho that these two young players, Mourinho didn't recognise their quality. They go on to these great careers. That must pain him.
It's a huge blight on thinking about what Mourinho did at Chelsea, and it's almost an encapsulation of the fact that, yes, he manages to win a Premier League title in 2014, but he's so short-termist about success that he doesn't really give two hoots about developing younger players that people like Emiliano spend a lot of time scouting and bringing to the club. Mourinho's reject team would include Salah, De Bruyne, Mata, I think, Matic.
Chelsea send him out on loan to Fiorentina. They send Salah away.
They do. And he's a January transfer. And I think he probably becomes one of the most successful January transfers that Serie A has ever seen. He scores lots of goals in Fiorentina. And then there's a queue of Italian clubs that want to sign this guy because he's on the cheap. And Roma end up signing him permanently after only 5 months playing with Fiorentina. In 2 seasons, Salah becomes Roma's top goal scorer in his second season. And he's also playing in the footsteps of his childhood hero, Francesco Totti. It doesn't take long, and Liverpool come calling to sign Salah for what is then a record fee of 42.5 million euros in 2017. But as we mentioned, this transfer almost never happens, Simon.
Yeah, so Liverpool have been bought by John Henry, who's still the owner. He's this American commodities trader who is obsessed by data, and he's a very good data analyst himself. And John Henry owns the Boston Red Sox in American baseball, and they've used data to find undervalued players. So John Henry thinks we're going to do the same thing in soccer. We're going to use data and find players not valued. And he hires all these PhDs, and he has this team of number crunchers looking for great players. And Liverpool need a striker. So the data analysts make this list of, I think it's the best 5 strikers under the age of 25 who cost below a certain amount of money. And Mo Salah is the top name on the list. The data analysts think he's really special. And they say, okay, well, he didn't play much at Chelsea. He was rejected Chelsea. But actually, when he played, he did pretty well. He's a good player. He just wasn't given a chance at Chelsea. That's their analysis. And so they give this list of 5 players to Klopp, hoping that Klopp will go for Salah, especially out of the 5. And Jurgen Klopp, the manager, he looks at the list and he says, I don't like any of these players. So the data analysts say, okay, well, we'll make a list of another 5 young strikers who you should look at. And they come back with another list and Klopp says, but this is even worse. And the data analyst says, yeah, it is even worse because you rejected the top 5 who we thought were the best. And so in the end, because Klopp, one of his qualities is he's a good listener. I mean, he's not a numbers man instinctively, but he's open to new ideas. He listens to the data analysts. And in the end, he says, okay, you have convinced me, we'll sign Salah, even though I don't really see why.
And it's big data that births, I think, one of the most legendary front threes in modern football. I think few of us would have thought that Mo Salah, a Chelsea reject at the time, Sadio Mane, who's playing for Southampton, and Bobby Firmino, who I'd literally never heard of, would then go on to be one of the most prolific attacking front threes in Premier League history.
Yeah, I think Liverpool's data analysts are particularly proud of the Salah-Firmino combination because if you looked at Firmino's numbers, he's an attacker who doesn't score goals. And so he gets sort of disdained unfairly. And what the analysts had been looking at was complementarity, players who would make each other better. And using very complicated numbers, they had decided that Firmino and Salah in particular would be perfect foils for each other. Bizarrely, that's the way it turned out.
Yeah, Firmino kind of does the hard work. He does the work that doesn't get too many plaudits, the dirty stuff, the harassing of the defenders, and he lets Mane and Salah score the goals. And that's almost exactly what happens.
It's very rare when a plan comes together, but in this case it does.
But Salah's success in England was in no way guaranteed, even if the big data models suggest that he was the best. Liverpool are generally sort of clowned for overpaying for what is seen to be a Chelsea reject. He's somebody who's thrown off the ball by English defenders in some of the games that he played against. There was this infamous game that Chelsea play in the FA Cup against Cheltenham. I remember Mourinho coming out after the game and saying that he's very unhappy with how some of his attackers perform. And the commentator says, or the pundit says, who are you talking about? And he almost explicitly says that Salah is one of those. So it was a pretty humiliating time for Salah. But the memories of this humiliation at Chelsea at the hands of Mourinho are very quickly wiped away in that first season at Liverpool, where he scores an incredible, and I think very improbable, 44 goals in all competitions in that first season. I don't think any big data model could have predicted how well this would have gone. And he is a vital player in getting Liverpool to, again, a very unlikely Champions League final that year. So Liverpool, who domestically have a very kind of unremarkable season, but they are a Champions League team, right? Those famous nights at Anfield in Europe. And Klopp is almost made for those European nights. And they have a very, very successful Champions League campaign. And it is, I would say, ruined by this vicious borderline assault by Sergio Ramos of Real Madrid.
Well, I'm now a bit of an expert on the foul because I've been watching it from many different angles in slow motion. So it's quite early in the game.
It's about half an hour in. We're less than 30 minutes into the first half. It's 0-0.
And Ramos drags down Salah by his arm and then sort of bounces him on his shoulder and rolls on him. Actually, this is by no means the worst foul of Sergio Ramos' career.
That's
it's probably not even the worst foul of
in the
Ramos'
Champions League
match.
final.
Yeah. Well, Ramos, this is just routine. And it's sort of very well done as a foul. You have to admire it because it's not even that bad, but because he bounces him on the shoulder, I think Salah dislocates his shoulder and he's weeping and he's in pain. He knows he's going to struggle to make the coming World Cup. And he goes off and then Real Madrid win the match, partly because Liverpool have
the most horrific goalkeeping performance perhaps in any final of all time.
I feel so sorry for the guy. I think we shouldn't mention his name.
You're not going to mention his name?
You've mentioned.
I think he's still a working goalkeeper somewhere.
He is a working goalkeeper, I believe, yes, although he has somewhat...
He's very, very good looking, so I feel like you can't be that handsome and good at football, so maybe it was just karma.
Liverpool lose the final. Salah is injured and the World Cup is coming up, Egypt's first World Cup in 28 years. And, the whole country is obsessing, will he make it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised Sergio Ramos was not on some hit list.
Well, I just read there was this Egyptian lawyer who wanted to file a $1 billion lawsuit against Ramos.
It's partly a measure of his success that Ramos highlights that if Real Madrid are going to win this game, they need to take this guy out. And there are lots of other precedents for this happening. The one I remember most fondly is when Tony Rudiger, Chelsea's defender, wipes out Kevin De Bruyne in the first half of the Champions League final 2021. De Bruyne goes off the pitch in tears. This is a kind of tried and tested method for the,
And a very early example is the young Messi 2006 playing against Chelsea. And I think John Terry actually jumps on him in the penalty area and crushes him. Messi at this point weighs about 25 kilograms.
You got to do what you got to do, right?
Well,
Salah
works,
is already the most important player in that team, and Sergio Ramos definitely knows it. In the end, I think people remember Salah, but it's Karius the one that is seen to have lost that Champions League final for Liverpool.
Those are two iconic moments.
So in a remarkable first season at Liverpool, Salah has already become beloved by Scousers who sing his name from the rafters. He is on his way to becoming a cult icon for Liverpool and helped change attitudes towards Muslims in the UK in subsequent very successful seasons.
But before we get on to that, is Mo Salah's shoulder going to recover from Sergio Ramos in time to play the World Cup 2018?
So there's about a 3 to 4 week break between the Champions League final and the start of the World Cup in Russia. An entire country, and I would argue a region,
the whole Arab world, yes,
is waiting with bated breath to see if Salah is going to be able to lead out Egypt as captain of the national team in the first World Cup they've qualified for since 1990. And it's a big deal because although Egypt dominate African football by winning the three-peat of African Nation Cups in 2006, 2008 and 2010, they're titled continental champions, a run that has never been matched by any team since. But they always fail to translate this dominance in African football into international football more broadly. And it's a huge source of frustration that Egypt just never make it to World Cups.
So they go to this World Cup and very weirdly, they set up their training camp in Grozny and Chechnya, this war-torn region, this Muslim region of Russia that's been bombed by Moscow in two terrible wars and is run by a warlord.
Ramzan Kadyrov, who is now a stooge of Putin and whose father fought Putin bitterly for many years in a separatist war. But such are the strange circumstances of this World Cup. It seems that Kadyrov almost personally requested that one of the Muslim teams represented at the World Cup had to be, of course, headquartered in Grozny. Simon, you were at the World Cup. Did you ever make it down to Chechnya?
No, funnily enough, I didn't find the time to go to Chechnya. I thought, well, Egypt, Mo Salah, interesting, I'll keep an eye on them. But suddenly, after about a week, they'd already been knocked out.
It was not a particularly great campaign. Salah does recover and he plays in the last two games of the group stages, but Egypt still have the record of being one of the few teams to have never even won a point at any World Cup they've qualified for.
Poor guy, that may well prove the only World Cup he ever plays. And he'll be remembered not for anything he did on the pitch, but for a banquet off it.
Let's go back to James to hear the story of how Ramzan Kadyrov meets Mohammed Salah.
Now, Egypt were, for the past kind of 20 years, the leading power in African football, but they hadn't qualified for a World Cup since 1990. And so every time there was this insane fever around the country about getting to the World Cup. They didn't make it in 2014 with Bob Bradley. They got to the playoffs and they had this like heartbreaking loss. But in 2018, they made it. They made it finally after all these years of hurt. So there was this kind of mania and all of that pressure fell on Mohammed Salah's shoulders. We're talking 20 years worth of pressure, is more 30 years worth of pressure is on his shoulders. Then on the other side, you had this insane situation where Vladimir Putin and the Russian authorities had to give Chechnya some crumbs from the table from this incredibly corrupt World Cup bid, which, you know, was all about patronage and keeping kind of various parties kind of well-fed in terms of kind of construction contracts and all that. And one of them was to have, of course, you know, Chechnya is a Muslim region, is to have the Egyptian national team training down there. But as soon as you saw Mohammed Salah land, again, he became a kind of this political pawn for Kadyrov. I mean, every picture that I saw of him, every image I saw of him, he looked miserable. I think it was his birthday and he had this cake that was the size of a room, which was bigger than him. But Mohamed Salah was miserable, being used as a political tool. He was really unhappy about it. But he also didn't get any sleep because he was being woken up at like 2:00 in the morning by random Egyptians just saying, I need a photo with you. As if that was kind of completely okay because he's public property. He's our hero. Of course. Why would he turn down that opportunity? So he was kind of exhausted, injured because he dislocated his shoulder, or whatever the injury was in the Champions League in the run up to the World Cup.
The Ramos rugby tackle.
The famous Ramos tackle. And you could tell that all of that history, it all came together at that 2018, which was, he couldn't play the first game. Egypt gets knocked out. He then says that he doesn't want to play for the Egyptian national team anymore. It gets leaked that maybe he might be arrested if he goes back by authorities. And that's what he's dealing with. He can't really say what he wants. He's in a really difficult position, protected somewhat by playing for Liverpool. But again, the danger will be what happens when he stops playing football.
So poor Salah, he's been fouled out of the Champions League final. Top tip, never play against Sergio Ramos. He has had this terrible World Cup, which may prove his only World Cup. But now he comes back to Liverpool for the 2018-19 season. And from then on, for many years, you have this fantastically happy marriage develop between this Egyptian footballer and Liverpool fans.
And he speaks about the fact that he enters that season after his first season with the tag of the one season wonder. There's no way that a guy who scores 44 goals in his first season can ever repeat it. He doesn't actually match the goal tally, but in terms of his significance for that team, who are then on the up, he is an instrumental part of Klopp's dominant Liverpool side who go toe-to-toe with Pep Guardiola for the next 4 to 5 seasons. And this is a period in which Salah really perfects his game. He develops his left foot just as well as his right foot, and he develops that characteristic coming in from the wing, switching the ball onto his foot and hitting top bins. That's a goal that we see over and over again in the Premier League against some of the biggest teams, against defenders who double up on him, and he manages to dribble out of it. And that's the kind of defining feature of why Salah becomes such a brilliant player, is he does it on the biggest stages for Liverpool.
And he becomes not just somebody who can run very fast, but who can act very fast with the ball. His decision-making is as fast as his physical pace.
Physically, he also transforms. I mean, I would put him up there with Cristiano Ronaldo as one of those footballers whose physique is incredible. He's only 5'9". He becomes a little stockier, so he puts on a lot of muscle. And I've heard Steven Gerrard and some of his teammates describe just how insane his lower body strength is. You see defenders almost bouncing off his legs when he's charging at them. And Klopp says that, Salah, who's now 31 years old, I heard him a few weeks ago saying that he thinks that Salah's metabolic age, so his biological age, is something like 19 years old because he keeps himself in such brilliant physical condition.
At 3 a.m. during Ramadan, he'll be in the gym.
Yeah, so he can't eat during the daylight hours, but he needs to get a workout in, and he will be using Ramadan as a time just to do everything earlier in the day, such as the dedication. And he's a Muslim footballer, so you don't really see him in the clubs or drinking or perhaps using some of the freedoms that life in Liverpool would give him. He is, and is often described by his teammates and his managers, as a consummate professional. So Salah becomes the fastest player in Liverpool's history to score 50 Premier League goals. He's the first Egyptian to eventually win a Champions League in that game against Tottenham, and wins the Premier League in the COVID-hit season of 2020. They are a team that beat Pep Guardiola's Manchester City to the title that season.
But to talk about Salah just as a footballer misses a lot of the point, because one reason you wanted us to do an episode on him was the way he seems to have transformed society, in Liverpool at least, the way he has changed attitudes to Muslims.
Yeah, and one of the things we do in this podcast is think about legacy. And it's a bit early to talk about legacy for a player who's still playing and is probably still at the peak of his powers. But I think there are some conclusions that we can make about the resonance and I think the importance of Salah as a figure. It's not easy being called Mohammed and playing football. There aren't too many Mohammeds. And I think it's also notable that he does shorten his name to Mo, which is often a way that a lot of Muslims make themselves feel a little bit less threatening to non-Muslims, especially in Western countries.
I think the name Mohammed is a particularly difficult one to carry around in Europe, and it's a name that gets you discriminated against if, it's on your CV when you apply for a job. It must make life easier for him that he's not publicly Mohammed now.
But even then, when he arrives in English football, he does carry the burden of Mohammed. And there are explicitly racist chants about Mohamed Salah being a bomber, which I heard sung by West Ham fans and shamefully by Chelsea fans too. But given the success that Salah has on the pitch, actually the Mohammed thing becomes a positive and he sort of turns around the stigma of being called the Mohammed. Now, as far as I'm aware, Salah is the only footballer who we can say empirically has been credited with helping reduce racism in Liverpool. Now, there was a quite unique study carried out by Stanford University in the US who look at incidents of racial hate crime online by football fans, and they work out that in the period that Salah joined Liverpool, Liverpool fans are about 20 to 25% less Islamophobic than all other types of football fans. That this is not an exact science, but I think the conclusions of the paper meet the eye test, right? Salah is a brilliant example of a very successful Muslim in public life in the UK, and his Muslimness is not really reflected in anything apart from the fact that, yeah, when he does score a goal, he'll bend down in prostration, a relatively modest gesture.
And that's praying to...
So when Muslims pray, they do the sujood, which is the prostration on the floor. And he does it, I think, as a symbolic sign to thank God every time he scores a goal. It's a bit like when you have Christian players do the sign of the cross or look up into the heavens when they score a goal. It's modest, but I think it is important. And the fact that he's called Muhammad, he has a beard, and he does small things which associate him with Islam have helped, I think, to help humanize Muslims in the West at a time when Islamophobia is still rife in this country and in many other types of European countries. So I'm not going to overstate the fact that Mohammed Salah has solved racism in the UK. That's not true. But one of the reasons I think he's become a figure that is adored by Muslims and non-Muslims is that he operates in an environment where there are just very few people like Mohammed Salah around. And I think that's worth celebrating.
I'm just astonished that Liverpool fans sort of have this pro-Islam chant, which must be almost unique in the history of... Go on, do it.
If he's good enough for you, he's good enough for me. If he scores another few, then I'll be Muslim too. If he's good enough for you, he's good enough for me. Sitting in the mosque, that's where I want to be. As chants go, it's pretty good. I mean, Scousers are kind of known for their sense of humour and their ability to take the piss out of themselves and their players. But I think that's quite nice.
Yeah, no, I think that's very beautiful that they do that.
Yeah, and it's uniquely Scouse, I think. I think in some ways the marriage of Salah and Liverpool is perfect, not just because of Klopp, not just because they're a club that has this almost like, you know, cult status around the world, but it's only Scousers that I think could have come up with something like that. And then there's other sort of stories. One I saw a couple of years ago, which is a far-right football fan who is a Liverpool fan. But when Salah goes on to become one of, you know, Liverpool's greatest ever players, he sort of has to reconsider all of his life choices and his racisms and actually converts to Islam in the end. So, you know, he's changing the world, one far-right football fan at a time.
Weirdly, one thing I've discovered during this episode is that Liverpool has a particular role in the history of Islam.
And the history of Islam in the UK. So to come full circle, Liverpool is probably the birthplace of British Islam in many ways. And the first mosque, or first registered mosque in the UK in the 19th century is built by a guy called Abdullah Quilliam in Liverpool. So in many ways,
it's a port city, I guess, with boats from everywhere coming through.
That's one of the many reasons. He's also an English convert to Islam. So in some ways, you know, Liverpool and Salah are quite literally a match made in heaven.
Oh, that's beautiful, yeah. Now, the weird thing is that all these political meanings get attached to Salah by Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen warlord, by the Egyptian autocrats who want to co-opt him, by Liverpool fans singing songs in praise of Islam. But he himself, I think, tries to be extremely apolitical and not say anything to offend.
I think it's one of the double-edged swords of being one of the most prominent Muslim sports people or even public figures of all time is that you're always under scrutiny. And Salah is a relatively modest guy. You very rarely ever hear him speak about religion, even his own personal piety. And politics is much more complicated because he is from
a dictatorship.
Exactly, who are watching his every word, and he's having to tread a very fine line. And this also means that Salah is criticised a lot for not speaking out on issues that are important to Egyptians or the Muslim world. And most recently, we've seen that many Muslim footballers, not just Salah, are criticised because they don't use their social media platforms to raise awareness or support for the people of Gaza right now.
But the ones in Europe who have spoken out in support of Palestinians have sometimes been punished by their clubs or by football associations.
Yeah, we're living in an age where your Instagram posts or some types of phraseology that you use mean that clubs can take action against you. I mean, notionally, football is not a place where politics exists, but we all know that's not really true. And I think Mesut Ozil, when he spoke out in favour of the Uyghurs at Arsenal, was a very early example that even players, Western players or players of the diaspora in big European leagues, in big European clubs, can be sanctioned for political statements. Salah has never fallen foul of that, but he's never really tested that either at Liverpool.
Yeah, I mean, he strikes me in some ways as very much a modern footballer in that he's obedient, he's hyper-professional, and he tries never to rock the boat. And he is a man with a social conscience who does a lot of good in private or in a quiet way. So during the Israel-Gaza war, he's called for humanitarian aid to be allowed into Gaza. This is something that many Egyptians feel extremely strongly about. He's called for the massacres, the slaughter of innocents to stop. And he gave a donation, we don't know how much, to the Palestinian people. I was very touched to see that in the village where he comes from, his father distributes money to hundreds of families. And so if somebody in the family is getting married, or if somebody is sick and needs treatment, or the family is just in great poverty, the father will establish, well, it's true, they're not making it up, and then will give them money. So it's a kind of perfect example of charitable giving. The new idea is just give money to the poor because they know best what to do with it. And this is what the Salahs are doing in their home village in a quiet way.
And Egyptians, despite the fact some of them will criticize him for not being vocal enough or a leader, in 2018, many Egyptians actually spoiled their ballot and wrote down Muhammad's name as their choice for president, which is not an easy thing to do in a country which is as repressive as Egypt, and any forms of political dissent can come back to haunt you.
So what's next for Salah, do you think?
Well, now that we know that Jurgen Klopp is leaving, Salah did sign a contract extension which will actually keep him at club longer than Klopp, but there's constant speculation that Salah is going to be one of the players that ends up playing in the big money Saudi league. And in some ways, this is the perfect denouement for
the Arab world's greatest ever player.
Exactly, that he will end up finishing his career in the Arab world. But I'm not so sure, because I think going to Saudi Arabia, which is not Egypt, of course, does bring him closer to the fishbowl of Middle Eastern football, to the scrutiny of Arab fans and Egyptian fans. And from what we know of the Saudi League a few years into the big money overhaul, is that not every Muslim player has a great time in Saudi Arabia just because they're Muslim. So I would probably bet on Salah staying at Liverpool for a couple of seasons and seeing out that contract. Also because he's still probably their most important player this season at the very least, and is nowhere near looking like he's coming towards the end of his career in top flight football.
And when we remember him, we'll remember him much more as a Liverpool player than as an Egypt player, because really, with Egypt, it's been a very disappointing era. It
has, and I think you could probably say that when you have a country that faces so much economic and social turmoil, it might be difficult for footballers to perform at elite levels. They had a terrible African Cup of Nations just a couple of weeks ago. Salah gets injured. He then goes back to Liverpool for some treatment, and that is a whole new round of scrutiny from players or ex-players like Mido, who say, we always knew that this guy was never really leadership material. He never really stands up and is counted when Egypt need him the most. So I think the relationship between Salah and Egyptian football is always quite strained, and I think he benefits from the fact that he's not in Egypt and is able to sort of escape to Liverpool, which I think is what he did when he sustained this injury just a couple of weeks ago.
It must be so much easier living in a big house somewhere outside Liverpool, quiet, than having to be in Egypt these last very difficult years, where everybody wants something from him.
Including warlords or anyone of any note in the Muslim world.
So what's his place in history then, beyond football?
I think given that his prominence does coincide with this incredible social upheaval in the Arab world, and that he is of a generation of those young Arabs whose dreams were extinguished during the brutal crushing of the Arab Spring, that you can't really ever divorce Salah from this context. And his success is a very rare story of triumph in a country where so many people face adversity. And I think that elevated status that he's come to have is not just about football, but it's because he provides a kind of escape for millions of younger Egyptians who were never able to fulfill the dreams or the hopes that the Arab Spring provided them momentarily. And I think there are parallels with figures like Messi, who also carries the hope of Argentina on his back, or Brazilians like Neymar, and every time Brazil are in a World Cup, they're expected to win it, and people like Neymar are expected to lead them. But I think unlike those countries that have brilliant footballers and seem to produce brilliant footballers every generation, it's not clear that Egypt will ever produce a player of the caliber like Salah again. And I think that's what makes him so special.
What would he have been if he hadn't been a footballer?
This is a tough one. I mean, I don't think the answer is a particularly heartening one. I mean, Salah has admitted himself that he doesn't really know what he would have done if football didn't work out for him. And given that he came from a very modest family in a rural, poor part of Egypt, where all of the other players that he played against never really cracked professional football, and football itself became such a politicized issue in post-revolution Egypt. It's not obvious, right? So the aspirations of lower middle classes in Egypt, were derailed when Sisi came into power.
There must be so many people of his age who never had a proper job, never had a fulfilling job, can hardly feed their families, and that's the kind of place in Egypt that he would be in if he hadn't been a footballer.
Yeah, the regime of Sisi cracks down on all types of freedom, but it also takes away people's wealth. It expropriates the wealth of middle classes who are not seen to be falling in line with the regime far enough. And now, as we speak, I mean, Egypt is on the brink of economic turmoil. It's an economy that has also been battered by events happening in Gaza, in Israel. Egypt is constantly going cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund for loans on which it pays punishing interest rates. There's no obvious financial way out for a country like Egypt. And in the short run, it looks like things are going to get worse. So for the economic aspirations of any middle classes in Egypt, it's not clear what kind of life they're going to lead. And Salah manages to get out of it. So I think answering the question or the counterfactual of what he would have been doing if he wasn't in Egypt is a pretty scary one.
He actually, at one point, gave the government about $300,000 in an earlier economic crisis. So you have a footballer who's doing his bit to bail out the government. That's how bad things are.
How do you see the figure of Salah in modern football, Simon?
I think he probably would have wished that he had come from a happy country and had been a footballer who could just be a hyper-professional goal scorer, be with his family, experience his religion, and not have to carry this country on his shoulders, not have to worry about these politicians. I think he's not a man who instinctively wants to be involved in politics, wants to be a voice in the world. That's not him at all. I think he's a quiet man, maybe an introvert. It's hard for him when so much is demanded of him off the field. He's very happy to deliver for people on the field. I think it's the off-the-field hysteria that must be very hard to manage.
But despite Salah not wanting to be an overtly political figure, the truth is just by existing, he is and has become one. And in some senses, there are positives to be taken from it, particularly around debates on Islamophobia in the UK and how Scousers have taken him up as one of their own. And, I think thinking about his retirement, I imagine Salah wants to extend his career as long as possible because the questions of what someone like him does after retirement, there will be a clamour for him to return to Egypt. We've seen other figures that we've spoken about in previous episodes turn to politics. That's not an obvious career choice for someone like Salah. The regime will try and co-opt him to be a useful idiot for them, and he will try, I imagine, to resist that. But the longer he stays in the West or away from Egypt, the more I imagine some Egyptians will think that he has lost a connection with the country. So it's almost an impossible situation for him.
It's a bit like the Messi story. I mean, Argentina is also in economic meltdown. I don't think Messi ever wants to live there. I don't think Messi will ever live in Argentina again, and I can't see Salah living in Egypt. Would you like to hang out with Mo Salah?
So this is a weird one because obviously the answer would be yes.
Yes.
But then I'm also thinking about if Mohammed Salah, who has been at some points just photographed or videoed in the company of women, he gets a lot of hate for that kind of stuff. If Mohammed Salah thinks it's appropriate for him to be in the company of the opposite sex, then I would happily love to have some Egyptian tea with him. If not, then I'm sure maybe we could just have a nice halal email exchange and that will attract no scrutiny from anyone.
So Mo, if you're listening,
slide into my DMs, man.
Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms.
Next week is part 1 of our 2-parter on Arsene Wenger, in which we trace the rise of the man who remade English football. Check it out next Thursday.
This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
and Simon Cooper.
And this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.